Higher Order of Synesthetic Synchronicity, a Salvia Divinorum 40x extract and Wormwood trip report by Intronaut, posted to earwid.org February 7th, 2025. Immediately before this experience started, I smoked an entire joint of nothing but wormwood to myself. This caused me to feel very mildly, pleasantly stoned, but I don't believe it significantly influenced my experience once it officially started. Also, the Salvia I have is 40x, which I purchased no less than 3 years ago. It has been sitting in a little plastic container for that time, and I've noticed that the potency has decreased dramatically. If this were not the case, I'm sure I would have had a much more intense experience on the very first attempt. I've been smoking Salvia on and off for almost 6 years, and in that time I've had almost 50 experiences. This experiment mirrored several of my past ones. I started smoking at around 9:30 PM and made 3 separate attempts. Each time I loaded more Salvia flakes into the bowl and tried to finish it all in one hit. I laid in bed blindfolded with the lights off for roughly 25 minutes before I got up and started writing. I wrote continuously, and within 3 paragraphs I progressed from feeling very high to being more or less sober. The ellipses do not indicate that any time has passed, just that my consciousnness has shifted gears. The music I listen to is an album of collaboration between a Bulgarian women's choir, Angelate, and a group of Tuvan throat singers, Her 2. The album is called Fly, Fly My Sadness. I picked this album after about an hour of thinking about what I wanted to listen to. I wanted something trippy, but also some kind of world music. The song I describe in detail in this report is actually called Wave. T plus 25 minutes. Still very high. Couldn't contain my thoughts for much longer without writing them down. I believe there is a dimension in which all of our actions and thoughts follow a higher order. This dimension, like ours, is musical. Usually we are not aware of the synchronicities on this higher dimension, but our thoughts and actions always to some extent follow certain laws of nature. Physical and mathematical though these laws may be, they are undoubtedly beautiful. When we awaken to the higher levels of connectedness, we can take greater control in creating the music that is our very lives. I smoked some Salvia and found myself confronted with a dynamic physical reality outside of what I identified with me. This included every sensation I was experiencing and the sound of my thoughts and speech. I instantly felt connected to all of humanity even though I was alone. It was a process which was occurring to me, and being that it was somewhat mysterious, I felt some natural fear creeping into the experience. If I tried to express my reservations about undergoing the process, my thoughts were immediately interrupted by more amazing realizations. This state exists outside of me blinking my eyes. It arises from the undisturbed awareness of every inch of my skin, which at this moment was amplified by a subtle sheet of sweat. The fractal darkness behind my blindfold is shared by us all, is available to us all at any time, with the use of Salvia exclusively it seems, and it is completely, directionlessly aware of everything. I'm not nearly as high now. I lay in bed with the lights off, blindfolded, and listen to Angelite and Her 2 on my headphones. I don't know how long, maybe just over half of the album. During that time I took 3 separate but sizable hits from my bowl of Salvia. After the first hit, I felt myself melting into the fractal darkness that was, quite possibly, the collective unconscious itself. I felt connected through my thoughts and behaviour, and largely unconscious actions, to every point of awareness on this planet. This mostly involves humanity, of which I am a tiny part. But it was implied that this connection keeps going everywhere I might care to look. I got over the ontological implications of this little tidbit rather quickly, as it seemed so self-explanatory, and it is an experience I've had more often than not during the first few minutes of a Salvia trip. I embraced the notion of becoming one with everyone, but I knew there was more to it if I cared to explore. I smoked more Salvia, and entered a world with small bright rainbow-lined eyes poking out of every corner. I saw eyes everywhere, and surrounding every single one was a little fuzzy living mound. These were the sort of mounds from which it seemed everything had been constructed, another very common theme of Salvia trips in my experience. The eye mounds grouped together in organic fractal structural patterns. These 3-dimensional forms opened and closed before me, and I realised I was sort of flickering my eyes. Because of this, the visuals actually sprung from the faint suggestion of light coming through my blinds and peeking up from the bottom of my blindfold. I was highly aware of this, and the fact that I was still just laying in bed with a blindfold on smoking salvia. This, for some reason, seemed to prevent the visuals from becoming any more intense. I was still a little dissatisfied, and loaded more salvia into the bowl. I had no difficulty doing this, but with the light on, I was more able to notice how intensified everything had become. After torching the bowl and finishing it all off, I held the smoke in my lungs for as long as possible. I was thinking about the major difference between my previous 2 attempts. The first was so much more deeply emotionally engaging. It grabbed me and pulled me into a reality I now am quite familiar with. The threshold salvia universe of interconnectedness and relative confusion for whoever it was that just smoked some salvia. I felt physically and emotionally connected with everyone, but saw virtually no closed-eye visuals apart from a barely tangible fractalization of the specks adorning the backs of my eyelids. On the other hand, the second attempt was only visual. I felt detached from what I was seeing. While it was quite impressive, I was in no way immersed in the experience like so many other salvia trips, including the previous one. So when I entered the third trip, I was wondering if it would involve me again. As soon as this thought formed, I realised that its mere existence meant that yes, in fact, this trip would invade my personal space. I timed it with what I definitely consider to be the most intense song on the album. It went like this. Bulgarian female voices undulated in repetitive, minimalist waves. This seemed to represent that entity which I now think of as the collective unconscious. It seemed to be physically manifested in front of me. It also represented the thought that I was part of this field of awareness and behaviour, that I was inseparable from it. The very notion of the salvia trip involving me personally seemed to have transformed into that very indescribable notion of inexorability from all that is. And it was voiced by the female Bulgarian choir's agitated sea of sounds. Then came a male Tuvan singer's voice, rising above the chaos and apparently expressing the emotions in my chest at this whole situation. He sang in a language I do not understand, and it may of course turn out that the lyrics have nothing to do with how I felt, but I gained this intuition that it seemed so purposefully to coincide with my own otherwise inexpressible emotions at that very time. Yes, I have listened to the album about a dozen times, but never like this, with headphones on and a head full of salvia. I was clueless as to exactly where the song would take me next, and felt pulled along with its tensions which aligned perfectly with my own inner dialogue. I needed no words to release my emotions. The music did it for me as I lay almost motionless, breathing very deeply. The reality with which I was interacting also existed apart from my breathing. I found it quite comfortable when I exhaled completely to rest in the peace of that breathless, motionless, omniconscious moment. A tug of war was going on between the Bulgarian and Tuvan singers, or in my mind, the ground and figure respectively. The ground was the collective unconscious and my thoughts about melting into it. The figure was perhaps my ego, expressing its desire to remain separate and distinct, indeed to have the very capacity to express itself at all. It was a very poignant tension. At times the female voices would take over and the male voice seemed drowned, choked by too much habit and stimulus to make his voice heard. Then he would assert himself again and the background vocals would recede slightly. This dynamic became even more pronounced at the end of the song, when I sincerely wanted the female voices to leave me alone and let me rest in my familiar ego-bound state. The whole while this was happening, voluptuous visuals of fractal landscapes and architecture, all conscious and alive, twisted and unfolded in and out of my body. They sent waves of every conceivable emotion through me, and these waves distracted me to a large extent from the visuals themselves. The waves of emotion were packed with ontological implications which hatched and sprouted in my mind, one after another. I realised while the song was in full swing that the coincidences falling on my mind between my emotions, thoughts, the fractal darkness I saw and the music I was listening to seemed to come from a higher, more deeply interconnected dimension of reality. Existence was like this there, with beautiful, musical, synesthetic connections between all things, guided by a benevolent and playful consciousness. I've actually found myself there countless times. Despite my only ever becoming aware of this reality while meditating or dreaming, or under the influence of a specific few substances, it was actually always present, with or without me there to experience it. Absolutely everything in the universe was affected by this higher order of subtler natural laws. What made it so impressive was how the extent of its effects was dependent on the level of my very consciousness. It gave me creative freedom to follow this subtle, musical order in my thoughts and behaviour whenever I pleased, because now it seems I can tune in whenever I want. No Return from the Cathedral of Souls, the Salvia 40x extract trip report by Topher, posted to earwid.org November 3rd, 2024. Preparation. Before I recount the journey, let me write out a recipe for a great quality experience. Number 1. In advance, I fully studied everything I could find on Salvia, what to expect, where other people had gone wrong or gone right, the best method and practices. 2. I had smoked some dry leaves a couple weeks in advance to give me a baseline to determine if I was a hardhead or a softhead. 3. My friend, who was also my sitter, described in detail his own experiences with Salvia, along with experiences he has witnessed, some as a sitter for others. Number 4. Set a date, time and place in advance, so I could prepare both the setting and to have my house in order, meaning my thoughts. Place: the floor of my living room, laying on an inside-out sleeping bag and a pillow. Lighting: dim but not dark, evening light coming through the mostly drawn curtains. Clothing: comfortable, barefooted. Sitter: very good friend, trusted. My sitter suggested I lay down and just relax, meditate for some time. He left the room and told me that when he came back he would just hand me the pipe and I could hand it back to him. He'd take care of watching me. In the end, I didn't move a muscle for most of the experience, so it may seem that a sitter wasn't necessary, but this is completely incorrect. There's no way I would have had the same experience without a sitter there. I would have gone into it with all sorts of fear and hesitation that would have inevitably have carried into the visions. My sitter was of calm voice, caring soul and a good teacher. I am certain that a decidedly difficult trip would have been endured if not for him. Experience. As I handed the pipe back to my friend, I could see the world recede and I immediately laid back, rested my head on my pillow and set my hands upon my chest. I didn't even have time to consider what was about to happen. I didn't have time to be fearful or to panic. I was already gone. I didn't descend through layers of consciousness as I may have expected, rather I was immediately in another realm, a morphing, spinning realm of red and orange colours. This place was absolutely filled with other entities. They were all very similar to each other. Their bodies were a combination of red, orange and black in colour. I was exactly the same as them. I was no longer physical. I'd become the same as these spirits. There were hundreds of us, maybe thousands. These spirits were expecting me. They knew me as soon as they saw me. Immediately I knew exactly where I was. A place I had been before, and many times before, mind you. A place that I'd spent a lot of time in. Even now, this place is so familiar I'm sure I've been there before. I wouldn't characterise it as a good or a bad place, rather a mightily familiar place. This reality was certainly three-dimensional. It was spiralling and turning over on itself, not unlike the mass of churning humanity in a mosh pit at a show. Always moving but never blurry, very clearly defined at any point I would glance. Putting aside the spinning, morphing, physical nature of this realm for now, I want to describe the entities there. It was teeming with life. All the beings were similar to me, all of them were familiar to me, yet none of them identifiable. I was the same as them, no more, no less. We were spirits. We were all the same. I'm just going to put this bluntly. This existence was indistinguishable from death in my perception. I believed, and I mean I truly believed, that I was not going to be able to return to my previous reality. In fact, I was already beginning to forget about my life. I was only vaguely aware of anything beyond this place. When I first arrived, I knew where I'd come from and I realised that there was no going back. I was already through the door, and the door was decidedly one way. I can describe the entry point to this place as a three-dimensional gear set that churns upwards and cannot be traversed in reverse. I was disappointed that I was finished with my former life. In some way I was scared that there was no going back, but since I didn't have a choice in it, I accepted it, and the fear left me. I later described this place to my wife as a spinning cathedral of souls, and one of my earliest descriptions to my friend was, "This is like church." So there is a clear association to spirituality in this place. I also found a good characterization in this metaphor. Imagine an overstuffed pillow, and unzipping the pillow, how the stuffing would cascade outwards, and that you couldn't push it back in. That was the endless nature of this realm. As this spinning, rotational existence folded over and into itself endlessly, I would, in the massive spinning, periodically catch a glimpse of the life I knew before. Distinctly different in colour though, blue and green as it would pass by beneath me. I could see there was no real hope of re-entering that place. It was too small a door, and the world around me was moving too quickly. My former reality passed me by exactly 3 times before I found myself back in my original world. I don't know how I got there, but just as quickly as I was plunged into the spirit world, I watched it melt away into my living room. I was shocked. I was amazed that I was allowed to return. I felt briefly that I must have found some loophole of sorts. Nevertheless, I was completely thrilled to be home. It felt like a second chance, like those NDE reports I've read. I heard a noise behind me. It was my friend taking a sip of his water. At this point, I still am not aware of my full life, nor that this journey was Salvia-induced. My friend, having just watched me lay still for 5 minutes, said, "Maybe a Salvia immune, mate." And I said, as best as I could articulate, "Oh, I'm definitely not Salvia immune." I was amazed that he had no idea that I'd just got back from a trip to another reality. Truly, I thought, how could he not know that I just spent an hour in the afterlife, before life, side life, and parallel life? I proceeded to say wow about 20 times as I passed through many thresholds of recovery into the traditional reality that we all know and love. In the first level of return, the churning, spinning realm was merged with my own reality. I watched as the living room walls folded in on themselves and the air was obeying the laws of the alternate space. Melting, merging, morphing. In this first level of the return, I was completely in bliss that I had returned, that I even got to come back. In the next level of the return, I found myself waving my hands in front of myself and being able to push my reality around. I would ball up portions of the room and throw them to the other side of the room. I'd then swirl my hand and I'd watch the room follow suit. This was a very enjoyable, very playful portion of the journey. I was fully aware that I was me and I was home. I could feel some level of embarrassment that my friend was watching me believe I was balling up reality and throwing it around, but when I point blank asked him if I could see what I was seeing, he quietly said no and let me go on controlling the air. He called me the Architect of Air, still completely hilarious to me to this day. There were incrementally smaller layers or thresholds of my re-entry, as I pieced together both my actual reality and the journey from which I had just returned. It was exciting to try to explain the journey, and a strong feeling of general elation about my round trip. I would point out here another great part of having a great sitter. He asked me simple questions about the journey, some of which I actually had answers to, some of which I did not, but all of which helped me recall the journey that has allowed me to recount it to some extent here. Without him setting my focus, I would have lost this like a dream upon waking. I'm glad I get to keep this. There is still so much to consider. Alien Documentary. A Salvia Divinorum 40x extract trip report by Samatsu. Posted to Irwid.org October 1st, 2007. I feel it is my responsibility to report my experience with this substance, not only to inform those who are considering usage, but as a form of therapy for myself. I broke many of the guidelines of usage that this drug requires, and as a result I had a devastating trip. If possible, I would like to help others avoid a similar experience by learning from my mistakes. Let me say now that it was my first time taking SD in its extracted form. Before, I had smoked the leaf and found little enjoyment, a slight heat wave and a sweaty feeling but without actual perspiration. Because of this lack of respect for the drug, I did not properly arm myself with any information or to try to understand what the nature of the experience would be like. A close friend thought of an idea for his film documentary project. Videotape a first-time experience with Salvia 40x and interview the subject while in the depths of the trip. Looking back, this was a ridiculous notion, and anyone who's tried even the 5x knows that any attempt to give a coherent report of the trip as it's happening is practically impossible. But we went for it anyway, simply because we didn't know any better. There was hardly any preparation. Joe set up his camera and set up the sound recorder while I got comfy on my futon and packed half of what we bought, 1 gram for $50, into the bong. Joe rolled the camera and I took the largest hit I possibly could, burning the entire half gram. I held the smoke in for as long as my lungs would allow, then released. I stared forward for a few seconds and then things blacked out completely. All of a sudden, I was being thrust forward at an incredible rate. I was shot through different memories from the distant past. Each memory was its own consummate reality, and I felt completely out of place in each one, not understanding that it was all part of the trip. The terrifying part of this was that I was launched through dozens, if not hundreds of these different memories. It was as if a gun shot me through a book where each page represented a memory reality, and I busted through the pages violently, as if being born into each one. Soon after, I felt a complete break with all of these realities and my whole existence was torn apart. The pulling feeling that others have mentioned is definitely what I felt at this point, yet it ripped me into many pieces, and then everything went black again. I don't know how long that state lasted, but it felt like an eternity. Then suddenly, instantaneously, the swirling began. I was spinning at an uncontrollable rate, and I felt a deep terror that still haunts me when I think about it. I started screaming for help, and then way far out I could see a tiny glimpse of something. I tried to reach for it, and amazingly it seemed as if I was getting nearer. As I got closer to it, all the while wrenching myself away from that swirling void, it became a human face, somehow familiar yet not recognizable. At that point, I started screaming, "Joe! Joe!" I didn't know what that word meant, only it seemed right that I directed it toward that face I saw. Things started to open up. The space around his head began to fill with colour and expand. The blackness fell away, and I found myself coiled around Joe's body, screaming into his face. Then, I fell backwards and passed out. When I came to, I was still heavily affected by the substance. Only this time I could see and begin to understand myself, yet everything around me was very alien. I looked at Joe. He was standing behind the camera and let out a couple of laughs. This, as you would imagine, had a terrible effect on me, and this constituted the hardest part of the trip. I now thought Joe was some alien being who videotaped all of human existence for his own pleasure, and he was laughing at how ridiculous this silly little human was. I totally freaked out and curled up wondering if he would kill me or keep me alive in his dimension. Joe instantly understood how scared I was and began talking me back into reality, or trying to. I made it through the next 20 minutes by listening to him console me. When I was finally aware of my surroundings and safely back in a manageable state of mind, I was shocked to find my room was a complete disaster. My computer was turned over, my tuition money had been flung all over the room, books, CDs, clothes, they were all over the place. Joe informed me of what happened. I threw the bong immediately after releasing the hit and I fell all over the room in a circular motion. Then I grabbed onto him, started screaming his name right in his face and coiled my body around his. He said I was in a non-coherent, blacked out state for about 10 minutes until the time I woke up on my bed. Recovering from these effects was a hard process as well. I went through different stages. At first I thought I was actually dying. There was a feeling as if some hand was actually trying to pull my spirit back out of my head, trying to extract it out of my body. At first it was a hard tug, a yank, and it was horrifying. As it receded, I dropped the idea of dying, but I replaced it with the notion that I might be permanently damaged. My inability to reconcile with reality, to form full coherent thoughts and complete sentences, convinced me this was the case. However, thanks to Joe, I was able to overcome these fears as he reiterated that here I was in my room with him and that I was okay. Roughly 20 to 30 minutes later I actually was, with the exception of some bruises on my arms and shoulders and a splitting headache from where I knocked it against my desk. Now, I cannot say that I was able to recover any epiphanies or realizations from this experience. What I came away with was a deep-seated fear of death and what lies beyond it. This chaotic state that ensnared me left me without explanation, and no amount of logical deduction could help me forget about the foreboding implications that it carried. After the Salvia experience, every time I smoked pot, I felt an inkling of that pulling feeling. Any state of mind outside of sobriety was unnerving. No longer did I enjoy being high or consuming any of the hallucinogenic drugs that I used to love so very much. At night, while trying to sleep, I am haunted by the possibility that the Salvia trip was a view to what lies beyond death. What horrifies me the most is to think that maybe some terrible force hides behind this life, patiently waiting to snatch me up again, that hand will come back, this time ripping me with ease from my life-worn husk and dragging me into its sick and chaotic world.